Okay, we'll be recording the webinar so that it will be available on our website in a matter of a few days. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. This is Terry Behrens. I'm the editor of the Foundation Review, and I'll be moderating our conversation today. Hopefully everybody has the opening slide up front with the title and the conference call-in information. If you have any difficulty seeing the screen, please send me a chat message and we'll get you some technical assistance. So the call will be muted. If you have questions, I encourage you at any point during the webinar to send them in via chat to the presenters, and I'll be collecting all of the questions or comments and asking and posing questions to our presenters. So our agenda for today is to we'll do some introductions, a little bit of a housekeeping, and then Dan Martin will be making a presentation based on his article in the Foundation Review on tactics in philanthropy. We'll take a few questions just for clarification after that, and then we'll hear some comments from Alan Holt. And Alan was a former grantee of the DANS and is now working as a program officer himself, so he has both perspectives on that. And then we'll open up and start and take questions. I'll pose questions that have been sent in to our presenters. Okay, so I'm Terry Behrens, the Editor-in-Chief of the Foundation Review. We're published by the Johnson Center at Grand Valley State University. Our presenter will be Dr. Dan Martin, who's currently at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and was previously the Director of the Environmental Program at the MacArthur Foundation. Our discussant is Alan Holt, who's currently at the Margaret A. Cargill Foundation. Okay, and as noted, this webinar is based on the article Tactics in Philanthropy, the Case of the Moving Spotlight, which is in the current issue of the Foundation Review. You can access a PDF of the article through our website, which is thefoundationreview.org. Okay, and if you experience any technical glitches during the webinar, if you have trouble with the audio or any difficulty with the screen here, you can, as I said, either send a chat message to me or call one of these two numbers. So I suggest you take a second right now and just jot down that phone number in the event that you need it later. Or you can email help@readytalk.com. Okay, and again, please feel free to send in your questions or comments via chat at any time, and then we will pose them to our presenters at the appropriate time. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dan Martin.
Okay, thank you, Terry. We have slides here that present a kind of capsule version of the article. But it really starts out with that point about strategy being such a universal buzzword now in discussions about how to improve foundation performance. And I've certainly felt, based on a long history as a foundation officer, that really misses the boat. There's a lot of business school concepts that are afloat in our atmosphere that are presented as advice for foundation managers, and my feeling is that is often inappropriate. So we're not recommending in this article any kind of best practice. In fact, saying that best practice is probably not a very good concept if it leads to homogenization in private philanthropy, because diversity, the very diversity that characterizes private philanthropy and private foundations, is one of their greatest virtues. So the article attempts to challenge the claims about foundations needing to be strategic, and only uses the MacArthur Foundation Environment Program as a specific case, because it was a real program and has been making grants in that area using this moving spotlight procedure since 1989. So the point is that all of this discussion about strategy leads to ignoring the purely tactical aspects of foundation work, and it is part of the risk that buzzwords present in substituting for careful thought and explicit choices buzzwords that pass for some kind of common understanding. And in doing this, the article says that that it's critical to developing a grant-making program, italicized the word program, emphasizing a collective set of actions rather than a list of grants in a particular field. It appears that many patterns in foundation grant-making are adopted without a great deal of consideration, and that's, of course, the risk with buzzwords. So here's the very simple distinction about goals and techniques for achieving them. I think anybody profits from considering them distinctively. And the article contends that there are a lot of announcements about foundation strategies that really are not arrived at in any way that should qualify as a strategic process. So what is a strategic strategy is the question that we need to answer in a different article than this one. But we do make the point that this is not automatic. Okay. So the MacArthur program is merely an illustration of how in one tangible case some unusual procedures or tactics were used, and the point is certainly that tactical experimentation is very desirable, and that's different from saying here's a best practice that everybody should use. The point throughout is that the Foundation's strategic choices that were data-based and therefore falsifiable, that gave us a lot of opportunity to say to grant seekers that if they thought our data that supported our choices of focal points were incorrect, we would change. That it wasn't just coming out of the blue that the MacArthur Foundation was interested in X, and that's all you need to know. But the critical thing that made the moving spotlight distinctive was making grants in specific geographic areas and thematic areas simultaneously in one package for 3-year periods. And that put the pressure on the program officers to develop a tapestry or a distinctive pattern with an explicit strategy in each case, using that structured approach as a source of discipline. So you see there the other points ticked off. The evaluation done by outside consultants was done at set intervals. The amounts were declining. I'll come back to that. And the assumption always was we would do at least 3 of those 3-year cycles, meaning roughly 10 years, before considering a different location or a different tactical focus. And then we asked for annual reports, but the meetings that occurred for all the grantees and others in a region or a theme at the end of, or as we approached the end of the 3-year cycles, was a terrific source of mutual learning. So We were trying to operate globally. That was a strategic choice by the foundation board, and kept our staff small, so we weren't spending a lot of money on staff. And the point there in bold at the bottom is that that process that we used in each place shaped those specific substantive strategies that were appropriately different in each place. And when you're working globally, you have very different circumstances. If you're working in a metropolitan area or a state or even in the United States, that may be a very different situation. This table shows how that spotlight moved for a while, and you see we had 3 program officers, each for a major area, and they prepared one package of grant recommendations for the board of directors per year. So they could plan their work around at one time, which was set way in advance when they would be asked to do that, and then come back around in the same cycle. So not only could the program officers plan their work, but the grant seekers could know when the foundation would be open to proposals in their area. This allowed us to make that distinction between ongoing monitoring and trying to manage the grants. And the evaluation done by outsiders who were hired by our evaluation director was evaluating, asking people in the regions to evaluate the way the program directors, the program officers put the packages of grants or portfolios of grants together. We thought that that by being as transparent as possible with the crisp guidelines and those rotating openings of the windows, we spared grant seekers a lot of costs that could be wasted, and we accepted letters of inquiry, not saying that we would only consider proposals that we requested, although we did request full proposals only after having a letter of inquiry. But we concluded that excluding unsolicited requests would put us at danger, at risk of missing important things that we hadn't thought about ourselves. And that last point, getting, at least reducing the prospect that submitting a proposal to a private foundation is like buying a lottery ticket. That's far too common and does not reflect well on our professional approach. These meetings of all the grantees and other people were enormously valuable, and we paid for people to come together in the regions where we were making the grants. And then the payment schedules reflected the fact that we didn't think that what we were buying was all there would be, that the foundation existed in isolation as if no other donor sources were there. And further, that unless our grantees could sell the propositions that they gave us to other sources of money, then it wasn't going to flourish or survive over the long term. And influence meant to us long-term action. So in the article, I illustrate that a grant of, say, $600,000 over 3 years would be paid in increments of like $250 and $150 and $100 to indicate both that we trusted the grantee that we had chosen to spend the money when it was needed, and that they had to be working on other sources. And we always ask them about the prospect for, in their minds, about other places, other sources that might be interested. And we were keen on avoiding the kind of inflexible budgets that that limit the impact of any grant by denying the grant seeker, the grantee, the opportunity to adjust and act in a way that's resilient. That just seemed so self-defeating, but that, of course, has become part of this approach that emanates to such a large degree from business schools. So then the portfolios with the spotlight on them at 3-year intervals put the premium on the program officer assembling a variety of things. In this manner, we proposed that a diversity of actions that converged on the target was necessary rather than pursuing one line of attack, which is often the style of a private foundation. And that meant having a diversity of actors in combinations that would depend on the particular location or theme. And those were quite varied, of course, but the point was converging effects based on the grants that were awarded simultaneously, and it didn't have hyper-defined constraints. So we talked about program grants, and the article discusses this as something between unrestricted general support and the more typical project support. And the way, it seems to me, the word project has become an automatic assumption in the management of private foundations is a serious mistake. Program allows you to support a major aspect or initiative within a well-established organization, and in the case of young and incipient organizations that you think have futures, to support a great deal of what they're doing without nailing them down in inappropriate ways. And this is the point here, that you can serve strategic objectives that way and attempt to support the transition that an organization might make into being much more of an institution, and therefore buy more for the foundation, this functional equivalent of profit, than a purchase order model for a highly specific set of actions might allow. But there were other dimensions to that, and trust and respect was part of it, because I think it's pretty clear that these very demanding attitudes that come out of some of this current advice for foundation managers and personal donors lead to a lack of, they indicate a lack of trust on the part of the donor, and that is reciprocated by the grant seeker. So this is where it seems to me there is a distinction between philanthropy and misanthropy, and it's sad to say that there is a good bit of apparently misanthropic behavior on the part of people in allegedly philanthropic structures. And you know, the more simple notion there is that those detailed budgets and milestones and what are you going to get done by the 31st of March, that may be appropriate in business settings where the profit and loss statement is your objective. In large efforts to make changes in social systems, that just doesn't work. The other thing was our trying to maintain at the same time both flexibility and structure, so that tactics gave us, with those schedules at the 3-year, with the 3-year cycles, gave us a lot of structure, and it was within that structure that the premium was put on the program officers to demonstrate and to support flexibility on the part of the grantees, and therefore their resilience and therefore their long-term influence. And that's where we came up with a simple kind of axiom. This was left out of the text that's published, but I'd like to develop this further with people who are experienced in the field, and that is that to the extent a foundation or donor wants to maximize its influence, it must minimize its effort to control the grantee. And simultaneously, to the extent a donor or a foundation wishes to maximize its effort to control the grantee, it will minimize its influence. And that flies in the face of a lot of the currently accepted advice, or widely touted advice, to foundation managers. So just those, ticking off those points on the slide you see in the conclusion. So what? We say that homogenization is a bad idea. Having diversity of both strategies and tactics is a great strength, the fundamental value of private philanthropy. And it will and should remain eccentric and not homogenized. And that we were concerned about what happened, not just during the term of our grants, but what might happen as a consequence of the grants with others coming into support, or we would make renew grants that could happen 3 times in a row over a 9 to 10 year period. And that didn't happen all the time, but it happened some of the time. The bottom point there, that thinking only about what your foundation is buying just really limits what happens as a result. So just to recap here, we talked about these bullet items that are elements of style, or tactics. They are all pretty mundane things, and not elements of strategic choice. But the point there at the bottom, that our priorities were open to challenge, affected the attitudes that we could take toward grantees, and saying, if you can show us that we're wrong, because here are the data on which we base our choices. That was a respectful approach to those people. And then the evaluation of what we'd done was very much enhanced by the simultaneity of the actions and their starting and ending at the same time. And the metaphor that's in the article is the difference between stop-action photography, where you can see something that's happening slowly and understand it better than you can by watching it every minute. The opening of a flower is the kind of thing that is often done that way. And the time exposure, where you keep the shutter of the camera open, gives you a blurry picture. So our sense was that by doing the conscientious monitoring, so we knew what was going on, but evaluating simultaneously at those preset intervals allowed us to understand what was happening that was really important. There can be a lot of short-term static or fluctuation in a system that just doesn't show up short-term. We could explain our negative decisions because of having the crisp guidelines. And we based second and third round grantee cycles on those meetings and on the external evaluation that was done by our evaluation department. So the short-term project is often so artificial in the life of a grant-seeking organization that we put the emphasis on long-term influence as opposed to short-term control. And I think that the contention is that that is how a foundation buys more with its grant budgets than you can with a highly controlled project. So it ends up with the notion of grant making as a craft. And a craft requires both technique, which is like the tactics or the structure, and creativity, which is like the flexibility. Craft items are made by hand. They don't lend themselves to algorithms. And craft items combine something that they have a practical use, and they're beautiful in some fashion or another. So thinking about the style of a foundation grant-making program is what this is all about. And having that concept of craft that combines art and science, beauty and usefulness, subtlety and practicality is what we're urging, and that is something that is very individual. The work of artists who are disciplined. So that's more than enough, and Alan experienced this as a grantee.
Thank you,
Sure.
Dan. There were a couple questions of clarification and then some more discussion-oriented questions. I'm going to ask just a couple quick clarification questions for you before we turn it over to Dan. So,
to Alan.
I'm sorry, turn it back over to Alan. I'm sorry, Dan. So that one question was about the monitoring and how much monitoring you actually did. It sounded like there were annual reports, but then you, so can you just elaborate a little bit on what kind of monitoring you did? And again, pretty briefly.
Annual reports, and then visits in the program officers spent a lot of time in the field. And many of them, most of them, came from the regions in which, in the geographic regions that the foundation was active. So that got them in on the cultural subtleties that an American expert working in Southeast Asia doesn't necessarily possess. Gossip circles, getting a sense about the reputations of organizations and their leaders. So that was a way of monitoring without attempting to direct. The other side of that is that if your staff is directing the grantee, then I don't know. I think that closeness makes it much harder to evaluate. You evaluate sensibly when you maintain a little distance from the what you're evaluating.
Okay. We have a couple questions about using evaluation results, but I think I'm going to hold those until the discussion portion and make sure that Alan has an opportunity to share some of his perspectives. So Alan, please go ahead.
Great, thanks, and thanks for the chance to reflect on these things, both as a former grantee of Dan's and the MacArthur Foundations, and as a new grantor, helping to organize the Margaret Cargill Foundation's Environment Program. A couple things, and then I look forward to participating in the discussion. As a grantee, we were one of the first, I suppose, late 80s, early 90s in MacArthur's experiment, if you will. But what really stood out for us as grantees in Hawaii, as a conservation organization, was the central point that Dan's making, and that is, of course, we were delighted that the MacArthur Foundation had chosen a goal or strategy that included our work. We were in a hot spot of biodiversity. But what really stood out for us over time, both in terms of our relationship with the funder and in terms of the influence that their funds had on our success, was the style or tactics used by the funder. And I guess I would summarize that relationship as a honest co-strategist, honoring us as the people in the field who should know what the most about what's going on, but being there to bounce ideas around, compare notes on successes and failures, and just the basis for really honest feedback in both directions. The longevity or the term of the grants was also, it let us keep our eyes on the ball, which was the work, not on the next proposal we needed to write. And the idea that we knew that Dan and his colleagues were interested in the success of Hawaiian conservation, not just the success of our organization, invited us to think or model the behavior of thinking about our work in the context of other organizations, and put us in a position to suggest to others how they might access MacArthur funds, to suggest to MacArthur who they might, what kind of capacities our community needed, and actually helped us become better partners in that community. So it was a great relationship. It had great effect in our case. It gave us the basis for building a healthy organization that's still going today, and it modeled some behaviors that were good for us to to implement ourselves as good collaborating conservationists in a community of conservationists. So it had great influence that way. As I took on this job, in my first job as a grant maker, starting 3 years ago, I looked around for models, and of course my experience with MacArthur really stood out, and suggested to our board that since we were also going to have a potentially global scope with a strong focus on community-based biodiversity conservation, and a relatively small goal to have a small staff, we have tried on the moving spotlight ourselves. Very similar structure to what you would see at MacArthur. Same staff size, 3 program officers. We're trying to work in about 9 areas, and with 3 of them under each program officer, and making suites of grants or portfolios of grants. And I guess without repeating everything that Dan said, because we have really adopted a number of the ideas that MacArthur still uses, there are some differences, of course. We're not in the same place. We don't have the same board. So naturally we have some different values. There's certain kinds of work we won't fund. For example, our founder did not want us to work directly on policy advocacy. But by going in with a portfolio concept in mind, it's also led us to look for a portfolio of collaborating funders from the outset who can cover some of the things that we know are necessary, but we are not going to be able to fund. So we can have a sense of how the parts of the funding puzzle that we might be able to provide can be complementary to those of other funders. That's been a good sort of spin-off of the portfolio concept. We have different risk tolerances, different sense of what reporting requirements should be, and it's early on, so I can't really comment on those for our foundation. But we're excited about giving it a try, and so far it's looking really promising. And maybe I'll just leave it right there for now, if that's a good place to launch discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alan. We did have a few questions come in, and Dan, you're unmuted again, so you can participate. So there was a question about somebody familiar with a report done by Michael Wells, who did a 2010 evaluation of the MacArthur Foundation Conservation Program, and 2 questions about this. One was that report concluded that biodiversity loss accelerated worldwide during the period from 2000 to 2010. And how do you think about coping with and operationalizing lessons from that conclusion. And then the other comment about that was that Wells concluded that small grants to a diverse network of grassroots groups was one promising new development, and how has that been used to adjust the Foundation's strategy?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in response to the first question, I don't think any private foundation should consider that it is responsible for the outcome of a global, the evolution of a global problem. Your objective is to contribute. So in the case of biodiversity conservation, all conservation efforts are simply attempting to retard the pace of species extinction. And I think Michael recognized that in his report, and he's very thoughtful. We had used him to evaluate some of the 3-year cycles earlier on, and so he was very familiar with the program. On the small grants, that continues to be something the foundation does, to my knowledge, although I don't stay very close to it. I've been away from there since 2001 and working elsewhere. But we always took an interest in intermediary grantees, grant makers. So you could give a substantial amount of money to a regional structure that then makes your retail grants because of their knowledge being so much more intimate with the small organizations, and do that in a way that is coherent. So I believe that continues, but the point is that if you make a lot of small grants, you've got to increase your staff, and that, of course, then diverts funds from your grants budget, and also runs the risk of hiring people who are American, in quotes, experts, close quotes, who are going to tell people in other countries how they should do their business. And that seems like a self-defeating proposition.
Okay. So you also, there's another question about how much tactical experimentation you really did. You talked about, you used that phrase, tactical experimentation. So how much did you really try out different tactics, different lengths of grants, different groupings, etc.? So would you really experiment with it, or was this sort of something you adopted and went with for the 10-year cycle?
Oh, no, it evolved. I mean, that list of traits that were in the last 2 slides didn't occur all at once at the beginning. There were maybe some attitudes, but there was certainly evolution along the way, both in the procedures, and we didn't do those regional meetings right off the bat. And the other thing that evolved along the way was the work with intermediary grant makers. Now, I could go into specific details, but there was certainly an evolutionary process.
Okay. Great. So, Alan, can you talk about what some of the challenges might have been as a grantee in working with this structure, this moving spotlight?
Well, I know from comments I've had as I've considered establishing the 3-year grant cycle as sort of the core of grant-making opportunity. At this foundation, naturally, there's been folks that have advised against having the door closed completely between 3-year cycles. So access to a potential grant from a funder that's trying to follow a pretty strict 3-year schedule is a challenge, but there's ways around that through, of course, other funders, but also through other shorter-term mechanisms. MacArthur and I believe we will also try to keep some agility funding, if you will, in reserve, but at the same time balancing that against a discipline of really trying to make this thing, these 3-year cycles, do as much work as they can. As a grantee, it didn't feel like an issue at all, frankly, because a 3-year commitment with at least a soft knowledge that the funder intended to be in our geography for roughly a decade gave me the core of a game plan to build on. It challenged me to go out and make the most of that money and leverage other money with it, and to know that it was going to be there long enough that I could run and innovate, and not so long that I could get lazy.
Okay, apply the appropriate amount of pressure there.
Yeah, good, tough love.
Okay. So some foundations have run into some difficulties trying to work internationally and using intermediary organizations. There's certainly been some incidents of malfeasance, money being not spent appropriately. Did you ever, what kind of safety mechanisms did you have in place for that? And did you ever have any of those kinds of issues? I guess that's a question for you, Dan.
Oh, okay. No. In fact, we started out that way in 1988 and 89 because we were brand new and going through the same kind of process that Alan describes at the Cargill Foundation, and relied on several large U.S.-based organizations that were very active in trying to build up national and local conservation groups in tropical countries. And we did limit our geographic range to the tropics. So they acted as the intermediary grant maker, and we were very happy with the results, and subsequently made grants directly to many of the organizations that they supported, allocating MacArthur money. And one man memorably said that he was so pleased when he started got his first direct grant. He said he thought it was just like he'd turned 16 and got his driver's license.
Okay. And Alan, maybe you could comment on this idea of the program versus a project grant. And what was the difference for you as a grantee in having a program grant from your typical project funding?
Yeah, I compare the story of getting a grant from MacArthur, in that case, from a grant from another organization where the program officer told me flat out, listen, keep this short, make it seem nice and tangible, that can be finished in 6 or 8 months, nice round figure. And we had some of those. You know, need to build a fence from point A to point B, $100,000. You know, a lot of funders didn't want to hear that one because it was just too nuts and bolts. So fitting funders together into a package, everybody's doing that all the time, right? So letting people be who they need to be as funders was great. But it gave us something to lean on, if you will, and to go out and seek complementary funders against.
So you felt like you had a lot of flexibility then in how to actually use the funds to complement? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, because since we were a community-based organization where our mission was to take our community to a place where we could sustain our biodiversity and all the things that stem from it, but focused on biodiversity, we needed all kinds of strategies and tactics, and most of them were unpredictable. Sure, I could lay out my best ideas for a game plan, but I needed to then get in the game and play and see what came up. And I did not need to be restrained in that. Couldn't afford to be too constrained in being able to be agile if I was going to be successful. So many of the best outcomes from our MacArthur grants were not what we described in our proposals. There were things better than that happened because we could go out and play. Mm-hmm. And that was our profit. That was our profit. He was in touch enough to know whether we were reliable, in touch with us and in touch with our peers and others who were perfectly ready to criticize us if we were doing something bad. So I could come back with I gave a talk on a grant I got 20 years ago from MacArthur to start a conservation biology program a few months ago. And by the letter of the grant, it was a failure. But I was at the 20th anniversary of the conference and partnership that it generated that was way beyond what we proposed. And Dan didn't reel me in when I, changed the game plan in midstream because I kept him posted.
Okay, so frequent communication between the grantee and grantor seems critical to this really working.
Yeah, and that's the flip side of the notion that somehow this is inflexible, because if you build flexibility into a grant that has that time frame that's not flexible, then you are responding to unexpected things and not getting into the notion of, oh, this is an emergency, which is a very dicey kind of conclusion to reach. What is really an emergency, what is not, and that can really get you into capricious action by the foundation.
The nature of how you take advantage of a funder like MacArthur was for us might change if everybody became that way, because the discretion and the flexibility is still such a rare commodity for an NGO, and funding with which you can go out and be innovative and agile is still rare enough that I guess if it all became agile and loose, you might have a greater risk of people getting sloppy about how they use any particular grant. But it's not the case now. It's that rare commodity that you use actually most carefully. That by being allowed to use it where we thought it could make the most difference, we thought about how to use that money more than we thought about how to use the $100,000 for point A to B fence building, of course.
That's what I say in the article. That it's the relatively flexible money that the grantee spends with exquisite care, and other funds that are tied down, you spend whether you really need to do it or not. And that's the way it certainly works with a lot of government grants. So that was.
I would have had to give back the money that I did not finish spending on the fence if I'd saved some money on it. So I didn't misuse that budget, but I didn't work super hard to spend a lot less on it.
Interesting. So these grants were in an area, conservation, biodiversity, where you could set very specific targets, and you did have pretty solid quantitative data. What are your reflections on how this might work in something where you don't have the data to set such clear goals or clear targets?
Well, Dan should answer this, but I need to throw in quickly that I don't think there's anything particularly certain or quantitative about biodiversity conservation unless you're doing it one species in one place at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when you talk about trying to maintain healthy ecosystems, that's incredibly complex, and it all has to do with social systems as well. So any notion that you can do anything that's really substantial and a large objective in very simple quantitative terms is a snare and delusion. And I think it leads foundations to waste their money. And the logical problem to me is, if you don't trust the grantee, why the hell would you make the grant to them in the first place? And then supervise them closely.
We should probably take a better stab at answering that question directly. How
does this work in areas that might be a lot softer?
I don't think, but we're not agreeing that biodiversity conservation is a harder kind of target than other social.
One of your opening slides was about setting very data, using data and being very.
That was the basis for deciding where to work.
Okay.
Because a certain piece of Indonesia has more species per acre than most places in the world, doesn't make saving those species in Indonesia a harder target, a firmer target. because you get into the facts of, okay, what would you do once you got there? But still, I recognize that perhaps in social services, or it would be great for the questioner to pose a situation that they think would contrast appropriately, and so we could answer the question with that in mind.
Okay.
It starts sounding like the tree huggers over here are saying our work's harder than yours is or something. That's not our intent.
Well, no response to that. Okay. So can you talk a little bit, and this one's coming from me, can you talk a little bit about the due diligence that you did on grantees? You talked about, and you can both respond to this. You talked about needing to have grantees who you can trust, and making this long-term commitment. So did you do anything unusual with your due diligence on these grantees?
One thing was expecting the program officers to be in the field to understand the circumstances in which the grant seekers were working, to be out there and understand their situation instead of relying on a lot of documentation and sitting in an office in the United States. I told my staff that until they were beyond the end of the road and beyond the end of the power line and beyond the reach of indoor plumbing, they weren't there yet. And we were told repeatedly by people in such places, often violent places, that we were the first Americans they'd ever seen. USAID had an office in the capital city, but they weren't out there on the frontier of biodiversity, and that's the answer to that question.
Okay.
First-hand knowledge.
Okay.
I know I've heard Dan say this, and I've certainly thought about it too, that he invested in leaders. And in terms of me watching him check out my leader, the director of the Hawaii program I worked in, and getting to know me, he had a really good sense of who we are, who we were as people, and who we were as part of our community. And then he bet on us. And the work we were doing wasn't secondary. It was, of course, had to be within the field, but the details he left to us.
Okay. That's a very venture philanthropy kind of way to approach it, actually. Speaking of using business models, I mean, that's what we often hear, that it's you bet on the person.
The person and their ideas, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Alan, how are you thinking about this at the Cargill Foundation with due diligence and?
Well, again, I should emphasize that it's only the environment program I'm speaking for. So, other parts of the foundation aren't necessarily adopting this approach, or it doesn't fit in some cases. But we all are heavy on getting to know who it is we're giving grants to, and trying to establish, a basis for honest exchange, celebrating failures that we can learn from together. So rewarding folks for sharing bad news, if you will. Those things are starting to emerge pretty clearly as kind of norms in the organization. It's very early yet, but Margaret Cargill was big on knowing who she was supporting and honoring them as the leader, as the doer, as the producer of results. And then she was also real keen on giving directly to communities in specific places, so that ends up shaping our tactics, if you will. And the community ends up being a great way to test the value of any idea or any leader. If you can get a sense of what's the package of things that this community wants to make happen. So we're trying to learn more about the places that these leaders operate in from a number of different angles.
Okay, great. So let me follow up on one comment you made. You said this approach is not being adopted because it wouldn't be appropriate in some areas of that the foundation works in. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What makes it not work?
Well, there's some cases where our board wants to just be able to do some local giving on a more of a project basis, where they aren't looking for a portfolio effect. They're trying to be available to do something our founder did, and she was sort of an angel, showing up to push a key thing for a community over the hump, if you will. So that kind of agility is something that some of our grant-making programs are being designed to operate on, without the intent of a sort of strategic design beyond an area of giving and an ability to be agile to local needs or to the needs of a particular community on a short-term basis.
Okay, so maybe something like funding for.
Well, and I would just I'd like to chime in to say I think that's extremely appropriate in local grant making, and of course, when you have a living donor, of course that's you're responding to that person's tastes and values. But it seems to me that local grant making calls for more of that than trying to operate globally, as the MacArthur program was.
Well, but Dan, some local programs, including those that MacArthur or Margaret A. Cargill are funding, do have a strategic sort of portfolio basis.
Yes, of course.
But there is some place for things outside of a portfolio approach.
Yep.
Okay, well, it's now 2 o'clock, our appointed end time. So I want to just thank you both, Dan and Alan, for your participating in this webinar today, as well as all of the other people who are online here. We will have, as I said earlier, a copy of the PowerPoint and a video, recording of the webinar on our website within a few days. And again, you can download a copy of the article there. If you are not a subscriber, you can apply your fee for today's webinar to a subscription. Robert Shallett, his email is up on the screen there, is feeling in a holiday mood. I'm sure he'd be happy to help you with that. And once again, thank you, and that concludes our meeting.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please stand by.